Alright everybody, and welcome to another video in the beginner scripting series for 2023. This is Spicer from Credit Cop Studios, and in today's video we are going to be learning about if statements. So make sure to stick around for that, and let's get right into the video. Alright, so let's go ahead and open our script here, and now I'm going to write an if statement. So first, first, before I even write an if statement, let me just explain to you what an if statement is. Basically, an if statement is just checking to see if something is the same value as something else, and if it is, then we want it to do this. So I'm going to write an if statement. I'm going to write if, and then part one, or actually, let me write a variable first. I'm going to say local part is equal to workspace dot part one. So I'm going to write a variable first. Now I'm going to write if part dot anchored, and then hold up, let me see if the part is anchored, and it is. So let's just say if part dot anchored equals true, then we want it to print part is anchored. Alright, so I'm going to explain to you what this is doing. So, as you can see, whenever you write an if statement, it's another code block. So that means you can like move this arrow to C inside the script, and it also has this N here. So it's another code block. So whatever we write in here, if we were to add local, like we learned last video, in this if statement, it will only be the script will only be able to access it in this code block. But for the sake of this video, we're not going to do that. So basically we write if part, so we're just saying if this part, which is part 1 in our workspace, if part.anchored, so we're checking if the anchored property is set to true, which it is. Then we write equals to. The reason we don't write 1 equal is because then it will think that we're trying to set this to a variable, because whenever we're writing variables we use 1 equal sign, but when we are writing if statements we use 2 equal signs. It's just how it works, and if we don't do that, then it's going to give us an error, and it will think that we're using, trying to make this a variable instead of actually trying to check if something is equal to. So we use 2 equals for whenever we're checking to see if something is equal to something, and we use 1 equal if we're setting the value of something to our variable. So just remember, they use 1 equal for whenever you're making variables, and 2 equals for whenever you're making if statements. That's just the way it works. So we're just saying if part.anchored, so that if the property anchored is equal to true, then it should print part is anchored. So since it is equal to true, it should print part is anchored. Now, I did forget to mention in the intro, we are going to be learning about else if and else statements. We're going to be learning about both of those as well. I'll show you what those are in a second. But it should be in the title as well, but I forgot to mention that in the intro. Anyways, we're basically checking if anchored is set to true, and if it is, then we're going to print part is anchored. But now let's say we change this true to false. So we're checking if if the anchored value is set to false, which it's not because it's set to true. So if we were to run that, it shouldn't do anything. It shouldn't print part is anchored. You see, it doesn't print part is anchored anywhere in here. It doesn't print that. So it won't print part is anchored. So that's basically what we're doing. We're just checking if it's anchored, and since it's not anchored, it's not going to print this. But now let's rechange this back to true, and now we're going to write else, and then we're going to write print part is not anchored. Let's actually change this true back to false. Let's change this back to false. So now, if I run the game, I'll show you what happens. It will say part is not anchored. So now, basically what the else is doing is it's checking I'm just gonna go through this line by line. So we're checking if the anchored property is equal to false, which it's not, it's true. So then it will print part is anchored. But since it's not equal to true, the script will go down another line, because usually it will just end right here and then it will never print anything. But now since there's more code, it's going to go down a line and it'll see we're telling the script else, so it's going to keep going. So we're saying print part is not anchored. So the script basically sees this first line and says, okay, well, the script is not going to print part is anchored because the anchored property is set to true instead of false. But now it's saying, whenever it sees else, it's saying, okay, so if that is not true, then we're going to print what is true, and it's going to print part is not anchored. So basically, we're telling the script, since this is not equal to true, then we're just going to print this. Alright, so I'll give you another example. I can do this with anything. So I can print, actually wait, I'm going to print this, I'm going to change this to true actually. So now if I was to run this, it's not going to print part is not anchored, it's going to print part is anchored. And then it won't print part is not anchored. So basically, since now it's set to true, it's going to just print this. And it's not going to continue with, it's not going to print this. Because it's saying since this is equal to true, then it's not going to print anything else. But if this wasn't equal to true, then it's going to continue and it will print this instead. So just think of else as like instead. So like let's just pretend like this said instead, and then we're going down and then it says part is anchored. If this was set to false, it will be like this. Since this is set to false, instead we're going to print this. Alright, so just think of else as instead. Or you can just think of else as else, because we use else when we're speaking as well, and like we're speaking when we're not scripting, we still use else sometimes. When we speak and when we talk to people, we can use else. So you can either think of else as instead or else, it doesn't really matter. Just know that if this value is not set to true, or it's not whatever you want it, or if it's not set to true, then instead it's going to print this. So that's all that else is. Okay, so Elseif is basically like an embedded if statement. So if I was to write else if, and then I'm going to write part dot anchored is equal to true, then oops, there's already an n here. Then I'm going to say print part is anchored. And now I'm going to get rid of this else statement right here. And now this is an embedded if statement. So if I was to run this, it's going to print part is anchored. So well, actually, hold on. I'm sorry. I put two part is anchors. I'm going to say part is not anchored. So it should write part is not anchored, because what we're saying here is else if is basically an embedded if statement. So it's basically an if statement without having to write an if statement. So like instead of us having to write another if statement and stuff and make it like that and stuff, else if is basically just another condition. Instead of you having to write else, you can use else if you want. It's just if you want to make a new condition. So else if is basically just like an if statement inside of an if statement. So it's going to go down and it's going to read, since it's false, if it's false, then print part is anchored, but it's not, it's set to true. So then it's going to go down in here and then it's going to read the second if statement, or else if. It's going to say if part is equal to true, then print part is not anchored, which it is equal to true. Then it's going to print part is not anchored. So this else if statement that we wrote here is basically just the same as this else statement, where we're going to say print part is not anchored. It's the same as this. It's going to still print part is not anchored, because yeah, it's basically the same thing. So else if statements are just embedded if statements, or if statements inside of an if statement. So yeah, that's all that else That's all that if statements, else, and else if are. Alright, so that's all that they are. That's all that if statements, else, and else if statements are. So, hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Hopefully you guys understand if statements now. And we use if statements a lot for, for making scripts. We used a lot of if statements to check if something is true or not. So thank you guys so much for watching today's video. And in the next video, we're probably going to be talking about loops. We're going to start an introduction to loops. So, thank you guys so much for watching again. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And I'll see you next time. Goodbye.